Hi guys, welcome to Ashish Academy, and now we are just going to develop our first application about that hibernate. And first we need to understand how we can develop the application and how we will set up the applications, and these are some basic things we need to require it. So for setting up the project as well as that the different jars and the packaging, so these are basically that is we will going to discuss later. But first we will understand how we can map our tables with our Java classes, and how these Java classes are mapped with the database tables, and how it is working internally. Then also we will going to discuss in the next session for that how we can set up that particular the first application development as well as the hibernate setup on your local box. So we need to understand basically how this particular object relationship mapping is working. So as we already know that is object relationship mapping is ORM. So basically object relationship mapping itself is just demonstrating that you need to create in Java object, it has to be mapped with the particular database table. So we will work on the Java objects, and it will be basically internally it will reflect onto a database basically, right? So that is we will see. So when we are just creating object relationship mapping or that, so basically here we need to understand we will create a one particular Java class, and that Java class is nothing but a POJO. That POJO is, let's say here we are creating a public class, his name is event. So we are, it is mapping with the same ID and fields, the whatever fields we have, same fields we will have into our in database table. So we are mapping with this into one of the configuration files. So majorly we are working in the configuration file. So that's why we are just working on that, how we can map, how this POJO will be mapped with the database we need to understand, and how the configuration will be read from that configuration, the database properties and other things, that is also we're going to discuss. So here we are seeing we have one table, his name is event. So we are creating that particular POJO, his name is a event. So event, there is a one private long ID, and there is a title, date, and that is a default constructor. And we have that particular setter and getters here, nothing but. So that is a basically is all about that POJO, right? So these are a setters and getters, and you can choose that particular type of that you can say variables or that particular fields, right, as per your own requirement. If let's say there are a date, so you need to take it as a date. If you have a string, you need to take it as a string. If you have any other integer, so you need to think properly for that all different type of, you can say, data types, which is basically will be mapped to a database, right? It should not be mapped with generally for any other string with date or something like that. So some of these things you need to be very much careful about it, right? Then also there is a sometime challenge because java.util.date has to be met with that SQL date. So basically there can, you need to take it very precautionary actions when we are taking about the data types. So the class used, it is a basically a standard Java beans, nothing but it has some setter getter methods, and then basically these have there is a basically these fields and particular data types for that particular fields. So Hibernate can also access fields directly. The benefits of accessor methods is robustness for refactoring. Very important point is the ID property holds a unique identifier value for a particular event, right? So basically this ID is nothing but it will be considering as a primary. All persistent entity classes, right, will need a such identifier property if we want to use the full feature set of an Hibernate. So you need to have that ID property, right? So if you wanted to really use that Hibernate features properly, so at least you should have that all the persistent entities. So persistent entities basically which we are using for going to persist into a database if you are any entity which we are mapping with this. So that is a basically called as. In most application, especially web application, need to distinguish objects by identifier. So you should consider this feature rather than the limitations. So this ID will make the difference. Basically it will identify the different objects, right? So different objects will have the different identity. So ID is basically nothing but you can say identify that particular objects. So that is an identifier. And we usually do not manipulate the identity of an object, hence the setter method should not be private. So this setter method should not be private. So these are some of the things you need to understand why we are using the ID, right? Only Hibernate will assign the identifiers when an object is saved. That is a very important point. Only Hibernate will assign the identifier when the object is saved. So you don't need to basically tell or especially insert it. So Hibernate can access public private protected access specifier as well as the public private protected fields directly. Choice is up to you how you wanted to match it up. So this is a very important point. 2-3 things. One is the ID. This ID is really required to distinguish the objects, or it's a basically identifier. And only Hibernate will assign that identifier when an object is saved. So when the object is saved, then this Hibernate will assign. The no argument constructor is requirement for all the persistent classes. So Hibernate has to create objects for you using a Java reflection. So sometimes people can ask you how the Hibernate creates that object. So you need to understand it is basically through a Java reflections. So the constructor can be private. However, the package and public visibility is required for a runtime proxy generation and efficient data retrieval without the bytecode instrumentations. That is also very important because it's not at entry level. You don't need to go into that much deep. But if you really wanted to know, basically Hibernate works on the basically on the proxy. So basically the constructor can be private, however the package and public visibility is required for runtime proxy generations, correct? So this runtime proxy generations basically, so that is the basically you need to understand how this particular ID works, how Hibernate generates that Java objects, and why the construct. So basically this proxies works, how the proxies works basically, right? So no one people sometimes people don't know about how this internal Hibernate works, how this particular objects are basically Hibernate manipulator play around and around with these objects. So that is you need to run basically. It works on this runtime proxy. So when the runtime proxy generation, so basically it interacts at proxies, correct? So now till now we have seen that some of the things that there is a different fields we have that, and what is the ID basically, and what are the different field types you can take it up, what are the different access specifier you can take it up. That is the basically in difference. As a very fresher, you just need to understand you will have that same fields which is basically available in your database. Same field has to be available in your POJO with the getter setup. Now there will be a mapping file. So that mapping file is basically you need to have the configuration file. How? So through that configuration file you will map that table with the database, table with the Java POJO. So how Hibernate and the system doesn't know actually all about that, how this particular POJO will map to a which table, right? So for that we need a configuration file. So basically there is also annotations we use it, but here we are there's a two ways. Either you can go with the mapping file, or maybe you can use configuration file, that is we can say, or you can use that annotation. So here we are just going for a configuration or mapping files, right? So don't be confused about it. So just we are discussing about the mapping file. After that also we will see about the how the annotation works. So Hibernate need to know how to load and store the objects on in the persistent classes. So store and load. So basically how in which table this POJO data will be saved, correct? So this is the where the Hibernate mapping files came into play. The mapping files tells the Hibernate what table in the database has to access and what columns in the table has to should be used. So this is the basically Hibernate mapping file here. So that package which we have specified, the same package which where we have created that particular class, and then we will start from the Hibernate mapping. So that class elements, in that class element you will see that event class which we have created, and we are just that events table is basically available in our database, correct? So that is the very general mapping, but you will create that. So this is a basically event, so that is a mapping between table and the class. So this particular mapping file, from this mapping file the Hibernate understand that okay, this particular POJO is mapped with this particular table. So that is a basically understanding here. Now let's go some little deeper side. So the DTD is basically is also important. The DTD file is included in the Hibernate core.jar. It is also included in a Hibernate 3.jar. So when you talk about DTD for that schema, which is basically used in that particular mapping file, so that is available here. So maybe you can understand how DTD is also works and where it is defined. So you can just see. Now, so we had told that how to persist and load the data of a class event to the table events. Each instance is now represented by a row in that table. So if we have a multiple instances of an event class, and if you are storing in these event object instance into some list or somewhere, so each instance will be mapped with the one row into an event table. So if we have 10 instances of an event class, we will, when we save it, it will be 10 rows into a events, like that. So like that, if you are inserting multiple rows right into a table like that, you can just presume that, right? So if let's say something 3 or 4 values you are inserting into one table, so you have 10 insert statements. These 10 insert statements are basically, you can see that. So if we, okay, so we can continue by mapping the unique identifier to the table primary key. It's very important. So basically, as we do not want to care about the handling this identifier, it is cared by directly from the Hibernate itself. So as we have seen that ID, so that ID basically, which is basically we have seen that it is creating distinguish. Okay, through this ID we distinguish the different objects. Okay, so this ID name is ID and we are mapping with the event ID. Event ID is nothing but in events table we have the primary key, and the generator class is native. So there is a different type of generator class, that is native, incremental. So there are a multiple generator class you can specify here. So each particular generator class has own use. Okay. So the nested generator element specify the identity generation strategy, very important. And you will have so many questions for how this primary key is generated in the Hibernate, what are the different types of generator class, how you will manage this, like that. So there will be so many interview questions can come up, you need to understand. So the nested generator elements specify the identifier generation strategy, okay, how the identifier values generate. So let's say if you start from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, how it will be. In this case, we choose the native, which offers level of portability depending on the configured database dialect. So what is a database dialect? So basically, there is a different dialects values for a different database. So from these dialects, you don't need to change any code basically into your Java side. That is actually a major advantage. So if you will change the database from MySQL to Oracle to IBM DB2, you will just change to dialect and you can easily map it. So that is a major advantage. If so, because this dialect, so many people will ask for, if you will change that DB from IBM DB2 to Oracle or Oracle to MySQL, what are the things you need to do? So you need to think about this dialect. That is a basically you. So basically native, which is basically is generator class native, right? So native, which offers a level of portability depending on the, so portability is when we are shifting it. So Hibernate supports the database generated global unique as well as application assigned identifier. So identifier value generation is also one of the Hibernate's many extension points. So you don't need to think about, basically there are multiple values. You can just take it as a high level for this generator class. Native is basically which is helping is for portability for configuring on the database dialect, nothing else. Now we have our own, basically in own POJO, there is a multiple. You have seen that title, date. So you see that how this property name is mapped with the different column. So this event date is mapped with the date and the time is the timestamp. Do you see? So this is the way the particular property of a event class is mapped with the events data table column. So this is the way you can map particular instance property with the database table column. So this property, this is the way you can map it, right? So the name and the column. So that is the basically you can just specify and you can see here. So if you have 10 properties, you can specify property name, this type column, property 2, this. So if you have a 10, 20, whatever it is, if you have a 10, 15 columns in your database column, you can have that 15 properties in your POJO and you can map it through this configuration file. So till now we have seen that Hibernate mapping package here. Then we have map with the class name with the table. We have ID. We have specified map with the primary key generator class. We have seen it, and we have seen that different property name means the different property map with the different column name from the table. So till now we understood that how that table will map with the class and how the different property from the class is mapped with the different column name. Correct. So that is the basically you need to understand. Now there is, if here we have seen that we haven't mapped with the title with any other property name. So here we have given the note also. So we need, why does the date property mapping includes the column attributes but the title does not? Without the column attribute, Hibernate by default uses the property name as the column name. This works for a title, however date is a reserved keyword. So in that case, basically Hibernate default it will take as a column name as a title. So if you have already title name of a column as a title, Hibernate default it will be mapped. It doesn't need to explicitly specify. But the date is basically a already reserved keyword into SQL or that in database word. So that's why we need to specify explicitly that event date we need to give it, and then we need to specify the date as a property name. Correct. So if you have a particular type of column name, you can same column name you can have into a POJO, so you don't need to explicitly map it. That is basically it is we are trying to tell it. So that is basically you need to understand. Now here the type is basically also very important. The title mapping also lacks a type attribute. The type declared and used in the mapping file are not a Java data types. Okay. So they are SQL database types either. These types are called Hibernate mapping types. So converts which can translate from Java to SQL data types and vice versa. So again, Hibernate will try to determine the correct conversion and mapping type itself if the type attribute is not present in the mapping file. In some cases, this automatic detection using a reflection on the Java class might not have a default you expect or need. This is the case with the date property. Hibernate cannot know if the property which is of a java.util.date should map to a SQL date. Okay, timestamp or time column. Full date and time information is preserved by the mapping the property with the timestamp converter. So that is a basically you need to understand that how the types are basically mapped it, how the Hibernate mapping types are working here. So this Hibernate mapping types are different from this Java as well as is also basically from database. So Hibernate makes this mapping time determination using the reflection when the mapping files are processed. This can take time with resources, so it starts performance is important. You should consider explicitly define the type to use it. So basically hibernate will take time to identify that particular identifying that different type of data type. So better is you should specify the type is, so it can save and it can improve the performance basically. And we can save this file name as a event.hbm.xml. Now, till now we have seen that how the main table and particular POJO is mapped, data types and fields are mapped like that. Now we will see the main configuration file. So basically Hibernate, the built-in Hibernate connection pool is no way to intended for production use. So basically here we will just go and see Hibernate main configuration file. So we can use a simply hibernate.properties file, or more sophisticated way we can use a hibernate.cfg.xml. So either we can use a hibernate.properties. So how this event.hbm.xml will be getting understood by the system. So we need to give some entry or something we need to understand. So there has to be one entry point for where the Hibernate configuration will be getting loaded here, and that different POJO and different class files will be getting loaded. For that we need to have a main configuration file that is called as a Hibernate configuration file, where we will specify the database properties. That is a basically you will see Hibernate configuration. Either we can call it as a hibernate.cfg.xml or we can say hibernate.properties. So that is the main entry point from which, and most of the things is basically we specify here, right? And so you will see here all the property name is name, database, driver name, URL, user ID, username and password, which is basically is required for to connect to any database in any other JDBC like that. So you need to specify these properties. Database connection properties, that database connection pool size you need to specify. SQL dialect you need to specify. Here we are using HSQL dialect. If you have any other Oracle dialect, so this dialect value will be changed based on the database. Either if you are using a MySQL database, you need to specify the MySQL dialect. If you are using IBM DB2, if you are using Oracle, so you need to specify different dialect values. So when you are, it's basically helping it to you with portability. Basically when you are shifting from one database to another database, that is the basically major advantage of a Hibernate. Disable the second level cache. So if you are using any second level cache, then you need to also specify. So that is basically for disabling or enabling, right? Echoing all executed SQL statement to std out. So if you wanted to print that SQL, right, into your logs, so how you can specify, because how what SQL is getting executed, because you are working on the Hibernate, you don't need know basically what are the basic SQL is executed at the back end. So you can see the SQL statements also. So that is the way you can see. So these are some of the properties. Or drop and recreate the database schema on the startup, that is also you can specify. And very important thing, you can specify the different instance or the POJO HBM files like that. If let's say if you have 10 tables, if you have 10 schemas, so each mapping resources you need to specify. So if you have 10 tables and 10 POJOs, so in the same 10 POJOs you will have each POJO you will have one single HBM file, event.hbm, where you will in event.hbm file we have already seen where we have specified that class with the table mapping and the properties with the column mapping. So if you have 10 tables, you will have 10 HBMs, and you need to specify all the 10 HBM files here, so that it will be getting loaded when this configuration files is getting loaded here, right? So till now we have seen that main how this event or particular class is mapped with the database table, and when the main configuration, again we can just go and revisit it. So basically you need to specify that session factory, inside that database connection setting, JDBC connection pool size, dialect, and that session strategy, second level cache. If you want to like this, there is a so many properties you will see you can specify, and main thing is you need to specify that mapping resource. So till now that is a basically very basic starter point, and that Hibernate configuration is all about.